In the summer of 1970, there is a photograph of the two richest families on the sea, two Greek tycoons who married two sisters. Between them, they control more oil tankers than most nations. Their children are heirs to the greatest private fortunes ever built on water. Look carefully at that photograph because within 5 years, 4 of the people connected to it will be dead. A wife on a private island, a son in a burning seaplane, a second wife in a Paris apartment, and finally the tycoon himself, the richest man in the world, dying in a foreign hospital while his empire dissolves around him. 13 years after that, his last surviving child will be found dead in a bathtub in Buenos Aires at the age of 37. And today, the entire Onassis dynasty, the fleet, the island, the airline, the name that once commanded presidents, rests on the shoulders of exactly one person, a woman who wants nothing to do with any of it. This is not a curse story. Every event you're about to hear is drawn from court records, declassified government files, coroner's reports, and the sworn testimony of the people who were in the rooms. And that's what makes it worse. Because when you strip away the tabloid word curse, what you find underneath is something far more instructive, a masterclass in how the greatest fortune of the 20th century was built, and a forensic record of exactly how it was destroyed, not by markets, not by rivals, but by the same qualities that created it. Both things are true about Aristotle Onassis. He was, by any honest measure, the most brilliant shipping mind of his century, a penniless refugee who outthought the oil majors, outmaneuvered governments, and built the largest privately owned fleet on Earth. And he was a man whose obsessions consumed everyone who carried his name. You cannot understand one without the other. So let's go back to where the fire started. Because the Onassis story doesn't begin with money, it begins with a city burning. Smyrna, September 1922. Today, the city is called Izmir on the Turkish coast, but in 1922 it was one of the great cosmopolitan ports of the Mediterranean, home to hundreds of thousands of Greeks whose families had lived on that coastline for centuries. Among them were the Onassises, prosperous tobacco merchants, a solid, respectable, wealthy family. Aristotle was a teenager, a middling student, the son his father considered least likely to amount to anything. Then the Greco-Turkish War ended in catastrophe. Turkish forces entered Smyrna, and the Greek and Armenian quarters burned. In the chaos, members of the extended Onassis family died. Aristotle's father, Socrates, was thrown into prison. The family's fortune, including the warehouses, the tobacco stock, and the standing built over generations, evaporated in days. And here we get the first glimpse of who this teenager actually was. While older, more established men froze, the boy moved. He ingratiated himself with the occupying officers, ran errands, carried messages, obtained papers, and worked the chaos to keep his family alive and get his father out of prison. Biographer Peter Evans, who interviewed Onassis extensively before his death, traced how those weeks in Smyrna formed the man's entire operating system. Rules are negotiable, officials are purchasable, catastrophe is opportunity, and survival belongs to whoever moves first. The family made it out. And in 1923, at roughly 17 years of age, Aristotle Onassis boarded a ship for Buenos Aires, by his own account carrying only a few $100s. What he did in Argentina should be studied in business schools, and mostly isn't. He took a night job as a switchboard operator at the British-owned telephone company, and understand what a switchboard was in the 1920s. It was the internet, raw and unencrypted. Commodity prices, trade gossip, negotiations between merchants, all of it passing through a teenager's headset in the small hours. By day, he went into the family business, tobacco. He noticed that Argentine cigarette makers used harsh local leaf, and he began importing the smoother Oriental tobacco he had grown up with, hustling his way into a meeting with a major manufacturer by, according to legend, he happily encouraged, simply standing outside the man's office for days until he was seen. By his mid-20s, the refugee was a millionaire. The Greek government, noticing this energetic young trader moving goods between Athens and Buenos Aires, made him a deputy consul. And suddenly the stateless boy from a burned city had diplomatic standing and a web of port officials who owed him favors. Most men who escape a catastrophe with $1 million spend the rest of their lives protecting it. Onassis did the opposite, and this is the first lesson of the empire. He ran toward the next catastrophe. It was now the early 1930s. The Great Depression had collapsed world trade, and ships, the most expensive machines a man could buy, were being sold for scrap value. In 1932, the Canadian National Steamship Company had freighters on the market that had cost $2 million each to build. Onassis bought 6 of them for about $120,000, roughly $20,000 per ship. Pennies on the dollar, purchased at the exact moment the world was certain shipping was finished. When trade recovered, as he was certain it would, he owned a fleet bought at 1% of its construction cost. Then came the insight that separates him from every other ship owner of his era. In the late 1930s, Onassis saw that the future wasn't cargo, it was oil, and he commissioned tankers bigger than anyone thought sensible. When his Ariston was launched, it was among the largest tankers afloat, and men in the industry called it a folly. His logic was brutally simple. A tanker twice the size does not cost twice as much to run. The crew is nearly the same size. The fuel bill doesn't double. Scale itself was the profit margin. Within 2 decades, that folly would be standard practice for the entire global oil trade. And the supertanker age that still delivers your gasoline today runs on the economics Onassis proved when everyone laughed at him. He layered on a second invention that would reshape the world far beyond shipping, and this one has a darker legacy. Greek-flagged ships meant Greek taxes, Greek labor rules, Greek oversight. So Onassis, along with his contemporaries, perfected the practice of registering ships under flags of convenience, Panama and later Liberia, countries that offered registration with minimal tax and minimal questions. His ships flew flags of nations they would never visit, owned by shell companies inside shell companies. Understand what you're looking at. This is the prototype of the modern offshore system. The architecture of anonymous ownership that today hides everything from yachts to entire corporate empires was pioneered, refined, and proven at sea by Greek shipowners, with Aristotle Onassis at the front of the line. The man built more than a fleet. He built invisibility itself. By the end of the Second World War, Onassis had money. What he wanted was standing among the great Greek shipping families, the old dynasties who still saw him as a Smyrna upstart with Argentine manners. And in the Greek shipping world, standing had a name: Livanos, Stavros. Livanos was the patriarch of the most respected fleet in the community, and he had 2 daughters, Eugenia, the elder, and Athena, everyone called her Tina, the younger. In 1946, Onassis, then around 40, married Tina Livanos, who was 17. And within a year, his great rival, a polished, aristocratic, equally ruthless shipowner named Stavros Niarchos, married her sister Eugenia. Stop and absorb the geometry of that arrangement, because everything that follows flows from it. The 2 most ambitious men on the ocean, competitors in every market on earth, were now brothers-in-law. 2 sisters, 2 rival houses, 1 shared dinner table at which every kindness was scorekeeping. Their rivalry became the most expensive sibling rivalry in history. If Onassis built a bigger tanker, Niarchos ordered one longer by a meter. If Niarchos bought a masterpiece, Onassis bought an island. The Greek press called them the Golden Greeks. Their families called it something closer to war. Tina gave Onassis 2 children: Alexander, born in 1948, Christina, born in 1950. Remember their names because this entire story is ultimately about what happened to them. Now, the 1950s, the decade Onassis went from rich to untouchable and very nearly to prison. After the war, the United States government sold off its massive surplus fleet of Liberty ships and tankers under a law that restricted ownership of many of these vessels to American citizens. Onassis wanted those ships. He was not an American citizen. So he did what he had done since Smyrna. He found the gap. He set up American front companies with American shareholders on paper, while control and profit prosecutors would later charge flowed back to him. For years it worked. Then in 1954, the United States Department of Justice indicted Aristotle Onassis for conspiracy to defraud the United States. And here is a scene almost nobody in the current wave of billionaire worship remembers. In February 1954, the richest shipowner alive walked into a federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., surrendered, was fingerprinted, photographed, and booked like a common defendant. The FBI maintained a file on him. You can read portions of it today in the Bureau's public vault, declassified pages tracking his companies, his associates, his movements. Onassis ultimately settled with the U.S. government, agreeing to pay roughly $7 million and restructure his American holdings, one of the largest settlements of its kind in that era. He wrote the check and told associates in effect that it was the cost of doing business. The empire didn't shrink, it metastasized, because that same year Onassis attempted something so audacious that it triggered a covert response from the most powerful interests on earth. In 1954, he signed what became known as the Jidda Agreement with the government of Saudi Arabia, a deal that would have given Onassis's tankers a privileged position carrying Saudi oil. Follow the chess. The man who owned the biggest tankers was maneuvering to lock up the crude of the biggest oil kingdom. The American oil consortium, Aramco, was apoplectic. The U.S. State Department pressured Riyadh. Accounts of the affair, including reporting drawn from the era's diplomatic records, describe an orchestrated campaign by Western oil and government interests to strangle the agreement in its crib. And strangled it was. The deal collapsed into arbitration and died. Onassis had finally found the limit of what one man could take, and the limit was drawn by Aramco and Washington. He absorbed the loss the way he absorbed everything and pivoted to spectacle. Monte Carlo. In the early 1950s, Onassis quietly bought control of the Société des Bains de Mer, the company that owned the Casino de Monte Carlo, the grand hotels, the beating heart of Monaco, making him functionally the business landlord of a principality. He converted a Canadian Navy frigate into the yacht Christina, named for his daughter, and turned it into the most famous private vessel afloat, a swimming pool whose floor rose to become a dance floor, a seaplane on deck, and bar stools upholstered. This detail is documented, not legend, in leather made from whale foreskin, so Onassis could watch his distinguished guests sit down and privately enjoy the joke. And the guests: Winston Churchill, elderly and adored, sailing with Onassis repeatedly; Greta Garbo, Marilyn Monroe, Prince Rainier, and Grace Kelly. A refugee from a burning city had made himself the host of Western civilization, and every photograph of Churchill on that deck was worth more to him than a tanker contract. It was armor made of famous friends. But the whales deserve a moment because they show the other face of the charmer. In the early 1950s, Onassis ran a whaling fleet led by a factory ship called the Olympic Challenger, and its operations became notorious. According to records compiled by whaling regulators and the accounts of crew members, the fleet slaughtered whales out of season, in protected waters, undersized, mislabeled, an industrial-scale pillage of the Pacific. In 1954, Peru sent its Navy and Air Force after the fleet, firing on and seizing Onassis vessels in one of the strangest naval confrontations of the century. He had insured against exactly this outcome, settled and eventually sold the whaling operation, reportedly at a profit, to Japanese interests. When the world's oceans gave him an inch, he took everything that swam in it. Keep that in mind whenever this story tempts you to fall in love with him. Plenty of people did, and it went badly for nearly all of them. Which brings us to Maria Callas. In 1959, Onassis invited the world's greatest opera singer and her husband aboard the Christina. By the end of the cruise, 2 marriages were effectively over. Callas left her husband, Tina Onassis filed for divorce, and the mother of Alexander and Christina exited the marriage with 2 wounded children watching. For 9 years, Onassis and Callas were the most famous couple in Europe. She genuinely loved him by every account of those who knew her, loved him to the point of self-erasure. Nicholas Gage's book Greek Fire, built on interviews with the surviving intimates of both, documents a relationship in which the great diva gradually gave up her voice, her career, and her pride to sit at the edge of Onassis's ambition. And Onassis's ambition, by 1968, had fixed on a bigger prize than any soprano, the most famous widow on earth, Jacqueline Kennedy. On October 20th, 1968, on his private island of Scorpios, Aristotle Onassis married the widow of the assassinated President of the United States. The world gasped. Much of America recoiled. Callas was discarded with a cruelty that observers said diminished even him. Understand this marriage the way Onassis's own circle understood it, as the final acquisition. The tycoon, who had bought ships, casinos, an airline, and an island, had now, in the eyes of the world, acquired Camelot itself. The financial framework was negotiated with the thoroughness of a charter agreement. After his death, the settlement between Jackie and the estate would itself become a legend, and we'll get there. His children were devastated. Alexander and Christina, already scarred by the Callas years, referred to the marriage with open bitterness. Alexander reportedly said the family didn't need another stepmother. What he actually lost, friends said, was any remaining illusion that his father's decisions had room in them for his children's feelings. And now the ledger turns. Because everything you've heard so far is the ascent, the refugee genius, the empire of scale and secrecy, the collection of famous faces. Here is where the same story becomes an autopsy. From 1970 to 1975, the golden world of the two families dissolved with a speed that no novelist would dare invent. May 1970. The island of Spetsopoula, Niarchos' private island, mirror to Onassis' Scorpios. Eugenia Niarchos, the elder Livanos sister, Tina's sister, wife of Onassis' great rival, is found dead at 43, the official cause, an overdose of barbiturates. But the autopsy noted injuries, bruising that a first examination attributed to resuscitation attempts and that a second, ordered by an examining magistrate, found harder to dismiss. Niarchos was investigated in connection with his wife's death. Charges were sought by a prosecutor and the case was ultimately closed by the Greek courts without a trial. The death ruled an overdose. Those are the documented facts, and this channel will not go 1 inch beyond them. What no court disputed is what happened next, because it happened in public. In 1971, Tina, Onassis' ex-wife, mother of his 2 children, married Stavros Niarchos, her sister's widower, her ex-husband's blood rival. Alexander and Christina learned their mother had joined the enemy house that their aunt had died in. Christina, then 20, reportedly attempted to take her own life in the aftermath of the wedding. The dynasty was now devouring itself, and the worst had not yet begun. January 22, 1973, Athens Airport. Alexander Onassis, 24 years old, the only son, the heir, and by the accounts of the men who worked with him, a serious, capable young aviation executive who ran the Olympic Airways side of his father's empire with more care than his father ever credited, boards a Piaggio amphibious seaplane to check out a new pilot. 15 seconds after takeoff, the plane banks and slams into the ground. The 2 other men on board survive. Alexander's injuries are catastrophic. Onassis flew in the world's best neurosurgeons, but it did not matter. The next day, with his family around him, Alexander Onassis was taken off life support. The Greek investigation found that the Piaggio's aileron control cables had been installed in reverse during maintenance. The plane rolled the opposite way the pilot commanded. Pilot and maintenance error, said the official finding. Aristotle Onassis never accepted it for a single day of the rest of his life. He offered a reward, widely reported at $1 million, for proof of sabotage, convinced that his enemies, and he had a long list to choose from, had murdered his son. No proof ever surfaced. Investigators found error, not assassins. But watch what the belief did to the man. Associates from that period, quoted across the major biographies, describe him aging a decade in months, flying at night alone, sitting for hours by Alexander's grave on Scorpios, a man for whom every weapon he had ever used, money, leverage, information, and will, was suddenly useless. He had built a fleet that could carry the world's oil, and he could not carry his son out of that hospital. October 1974, Paris. Tina, the 17-year-old bride of 1946, mother of Alexander and Christina, now Mrs. Niarchos, is found dead in the Hotel de Chanelale at 45. The finding, edema of the lung, with barbiturates in the picture. Another death in a locked private world. Another file closed. Both Livanos sisters were now gone, both while married to Stavros Niarchos. A symmetry so dark that Greek newspapers didn't need to editorialize. They just printed the timeline. Christina, who had buried her aunt, her brother, and now her mother inside 4 years, said openly that she believed her family was cursed. She was 23, and Aristotle Onassis had 18 months left. The diagnosis was myasthenia gravis, a neuromuscular disease that progressively steals the body's strength. The eyelids of the man who stared down governments had to be held open with strips of tape, a detail photographers captured, and the world winced at. He kept working because there was nothing else in him. He fought a final losing battle to keep control of Olympic Airways as Greece moved to take it back. He began, according to multiple accounts from his circle, preparing to renegotiate the financial terms of his marriage to Jackie. And in March 1975, In the American hospital outside Paris, the richest self-made man of his century died with his daughter nearby and his wife in New York. She flew in for the funeral on Scorpios, where he was buried beside Alexander. The empire, the fleet, the island, the fortune estimated at the time in the range of $1 billion, real billions, 1975 billions, now fell to the last Onassis standing, Christina, 24 years old, and by the testimony of everyone who loved her, profoundly unready, not for the business, which she handled better than the press ever admitted, but for the loneliness. Settle the Jackie question first because it tells you what the family had become. After a protracted negotiation between lawyers, Christina's side paid Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis a settlement, widely reported at approximately $26 million, to waive further claims against the estate, the last transaction of the final acquisition. The two women reportedly never pretended affection afterward. Half of the fortune, following Alexander's death, had been directed by Onassis into a foundation in his son's name, the Alexander S. Onassis Foundation, which endures today, funding hospitals, scholarships, culture, the refugees' money still building things in Greece, half a century on. That foundation, it must be said plainly, is the one unambiguous good the whole saga produced. Christina's remaining half bought her 4 marriages in 11 years, an American real estate man, a Greek banking heir, a Soviet shipping official whose union with the heiress of capitalist shipping stunned both sides of the Cold War, and finally a French businessman, Thierry Roussel, the one she truly loved and the one whose betrayals cut deepest. Friends interviewed across the decades describe the same woman: generous, funny, warm, desperate to be loved for anything other than her surname, swinging between crash diets and despair, medicated and exhausted, keeping the fleet profitable through managers while the tabloids fed on her weight, her men, her money. In 1985, she had a daughter, Athena, named, like the yacht's successor and half the family's boats, for the grandmother Tina. Those who knew Christina say the child was the single, uncomplicated joy of her life. She had 3 years with her. In November 1988, at a country club outside Buenos Aires, the city where her father's empire began, Christina Onassis was found dead in her bath. The finding: pulmonary edema, a heart giving out at 37 after 2 decades of grief and pharmacological attrition. The Argentine inquiry found no foul play. The last child of Aristotle Onassis had outlived him by 13 years, which leaves one, Athena, 3 years old, heiress to what remained, hundreds of millions in trust, the descendants of the fleet, the island where her grandfather, uncle, and mother lay buried. She was raised in Switzerland by her French father, deliberately away from all things Greek, and when she came of age, the shipping world waited to see whether the last Onassis would take the helm. She did the opposite, and you can read it as tragedy or as the sanest decision anyone in this story ever made. She became a professional equestrian, married and later divorced a Brazilian rider, declined the Greek language, the Greek press, and the Greek fleet, and the island of Scorpios itself passed out of the family, sold in 2013 to the family of a Russian billionaire. The graves remain by agreement. The dynasty's last member competes in show jumping and guards her privacy with the totality of someone who studied, from inside, exactly what the Onassis name did to everyone who carried it. The fleet that once ruled the sea belongs to managers and history. The empire's final asset is silence. So was there a curse? You already know this channel's answer. There was no curse. There was a system. Aristotle Onassis built his empire on 5 principles. Move first, own the biggest, hide the ownership, buy the standing you weren't born with, and treat every human bond as a negotiable contract. Those 5 principles took a refugee with a few $100s to the greatest fortune afloat. That is simply true, and no honest telling can pretend otherwise. And the same 5 principles applied at home produced a wife discarded for a diva discarded for a widow acquired like a flagship, 2 children raised as line items, and a rival kept so close that both sisters died inside his house. The maintenance error that killed Alexander was random. Everything that left Alexander as the family's single point of failure, the isolation, the enmities, the absence of any structure of loyalty beyond one aging man's will, was engineered meticulously over 50 years by the genius himself. Fortunes built on secrecy have no heirs, because secrecy is the one asset that cannot be inherited. When Onassis died, the invisibility he pioneered simply closed over his own name, like the sea over a wake. Here's what stays with me. In 1922, a teenager stood in a burning city and learned that everything, home, wealth, family, safety, can be taken in a week. And he spent the next 50 years making sure no one could ever take anything from him again. He ended up unable to keep any of it. Not the son, not the sisters, not the singer who loved him, not even the loyalty of his own body. The empire survived precisely one generation, which is to say, it never survived at all. And the one member of the family who finally found something like peace is the one who gave the empire away. So the question this story leaves on the table is the one Onassis never let himself ask, and it's worth sitting with tonight. If a fortune demands everything you love as the price of keeping it, at what point does the richest man in the world become the poorest one in the room?